This session obviously is focusing on online education, hybrid education as well. And the second one in the series will be a continuation of this one. Today we'll be looking primarily at design of online and hybrid experiences. And then October 28th, our next one, will be looking at really facilitating online ed. It's kind of a different set of skills almost that are even needed. The November 25th and February 10th roundtables are going to focus on writing, and April Schmidt will be the one that's really facilitating that discussion. And then our final two roundtables of the year, March 31st and April 28th, are going to focus on conducting research. And that one we're going to run with a panel. We've got some amazing researchers at Bethel, and so we'll be pulling in some of those panelists to talk first of all about how they find time to do any research, and then if they do, what are some kind of tricks of the trade that they found for either quantitative or qualitative research. So those are the 6 total that we have for the year. In terms of what we mean by a roundtable, notice discussion is the word up there. It's not a roundtable lecture. So it's a discussion that will involve these folks and then also you as well. If you lose it or you're done.
Oh, super.
So here's my technical definition for what I call these things. It's a conversation in which some smart person, or persons in this case, shares their content expertise, experience, passion with equally smart persons, that's you in the audience here, who dig deeper into the content through focused discussion. And that said, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And I think we'll have each of the panelists just introduce themselves first, just very briefly, and also just let us know the context. Where are they coming from? You know, what has their world of online or hybrid instruction look like? So we'll get a sense of who they are, and then we'll dig into really one question, today. So Joyce, let's start with you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Joyce LeMay, and I teach in the Business and Economics department. And I started with the world of online in 2001. So when it was relatively new, and I was at MnSCU teaching at that point, and we put our first online certificate program together, which was a human resource certificate. And that was really when Higher Learning Commission was even just trying to figure out how do we even accreditate these types of programs. So I went to Walden University and got an online teaching certificate back in 2001 because I was clueless about what even online meant. I think the other thing that might be a little unique is I didn't start doing online because I love technology. I always say that technology is really not my thing, but what I really value is that technology is a means in which to do education in a different way. It really meets student needs, and I'm really passionate about that. So that's one reason I decided to get started in online education. Here at Bethel, I've started a fully online class, Principles of Management. We also do in our department the internship class fully online, so students can assimilate what they've been learning in the internship. And then I also do a P class that's a hybrid, and now do another hybrid course as well.
I'm Bob Kistler. I'm currently working in the Teaching and Learning Technology group. Somebody else next to me. And I don't want to one-up, because I really probably didn't start really teaching online until 2001, so about the same. So Joyce has been in this a long time. But if those of you who have been around long enough remember Web Course in a Box, I was actually teaching blended learning quite a bit before that, kind of our precursor to Blackboard, to Moodle. So a lot of experience with different tools, and probably could go back even further to Netscape Navigator and building your own, which even goes further back, or back to punch cards. No, let's not go back. And I think I got into it because, again, like Joyce, I kind of saw that the technology opened up a whole new realm of learning as learning moved online, or knowledge moved online, our information society. So that I felt less and less superfluous sitting in a course trying to tell them what they need to learn when they could look it up much faster and probably remember it just as well, because then they actively did it as opposed to me passively telling them, or me actively telling them, but not passively hearing them. So I started out with several courses kind of just doing that blended as I was teaching biology and environmental studies. And then eventually when I became full-time TLT, I developed a course called Effective Online Teaching in the Graduate School, and I've been teaching that for now 10 years online, a couple times a year. And then I've also taught last summer, for the first time, I think Bethel's only fully online lab science course. Now, that's a challenge to do lab science online. But of course, in the environmental arena where you have a lab all the way around you, that's possible. So you just essentially involve them in the community or the home. And then the other course I teach online that I've done for about 8 years is a K course called Transforming Technology, which uses the technology as the framework for the course, because that's what it's about. So it's kind of lots of fun to do that, because it fits very well. So just a point, not all courses may fit into the technology, but some courses fit better than others, so it makes it easier to teach online.
My name is Matt Putz, and I'm also on the Teaching Learning Technology team, Bob. And I didn't get started with hybrid or online instruction through higher ed. I got started in pastoral ministry, trying to figure out ways to engage a group of leaders that we were developing in our church in between the times when they were meeting. And I also had an interest in web design and some other technical things that made it possible for me to dive into putting up some of the tools that we needed to be able to do that. And so I started monkeying around with Moodle back in the early 2000s and creating what I later found out was a hybrid course. I didn't know what that was at the time. And was also just in the process of figuring out what I wanted to do for my doctoral work. And so all of that stuff kind of collided at once, and I realized that this would be a great field to do my studies in as well. And then when I came to Bethel, I started teaching formal higher education courses. I taught a number of online and hybrid courses. Right now, the ones I teach, my conflict management courses in the MAO program is hybrid. I teach in the EDD program, the higher ed technology leadership course that's fully distance. So, and then I spend a lot of time just hanging out with, like, as Bob does as well, just hanging out with teachers who are trying to figure this whole thing out. And so I learn, in some cases, it's almost like I'm teaching through some of your courses as well, because I'm learning all the stuff that you're learning along with you. So it's a lot of fun.
I'm Lisa Simzer, and I teach in the grad ed programs for special ed and regular ed teaching licensure. And I have, I think, 8 different courses that I'm teaching that are either hybrid or fully online, and then a whole bunch of face-to-face courses too. I think what's maybe unique about me that I bring to my instruction is that I'm teaching online for middle schoolers, special ed at home. And so half time I'm at home teaching online synchronously with special ed students, and that's a whole different thing than we're probably going to talk about today. But if it's something you want to talk about, I have some things to share about that.
I'm Chris Erickson, the chair of the district department. I've been with Bethel 11 years, and I'm vastly the least experienced person when it comes to online here. I think my first experience would have been 2007, 2008. I don't think I knew the term to call it, but I created just that hybrid version of my Modern Europe course, which is a 300 level 19th and 20th century European history class. So I replaced a certain number of lectures with somewhat creative podcasts. And then more recently, Sam Walbury and I spent about 2 or 3 years developing a purely online version of Christianity and Western Culture, which is a foundational gen ed course in the Day College. That's kind of a 1 semester Western Civ course, plus elements of theology, philosophy, social science. And we taught that this past summer for the first time, 2 sections of about 10 or 11 students each. So those are the very slender credentials that I bring to this discussion. I think I probably stand in as the someone from the arts and humanities who's not a technophobe, is very interested in this, but is undoubtedly skeptical about the whole project. I think that's why I'm here.
But would wow all of us if you showed some of your work.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to start with our one question, and what I'd like to do is we'll just start with one of our panelists, hear their thoughts, and then I'd like to just stick with them a little bit and see what kind of questions you have, what kind of responses you have to what they're saying. So instead of having everybody talk and then forgetting much of what's said and trying to come back to it later, we'll just, I think, kind of pause after they've shared their thoughts, or if you want to jump in, that's great. In terms of the discussion, I'd invite you to converse with them. But panelists, on the same hand, if something kind of sparks your interest by another panelist, you jump into the discussion as well, too. So the basic question that was posed of them is to really So they can talk a little bit about what they feel are really the best practices when it comes to design of online instruction. And we're not expecting APA sources for everything they're talking about. I really wanted them to think about, for them, what do they feel are the things that really work for them, in terms of design of instruction. So I think, Lisa, we're gonna start with you here, if we could, a little bit. And, so why don't you kick us off?
Okay. Well, one of the things that was mentioned already that I love about online learning is it has a very student-centered bias. I think if you choose to go that route, and so I love that if I come at my course design thinking about who my learners are, who the students are, and addressing what I think they might need first off, things seem to go much better. One of the ways that I've found that I'm most successful, or students have the most successful experience, is if I offer as many choices as possible. So I try to think about offering my content knowledge in as many different ways as possible. Most students, appreciate a narrated lecture of some kind, but plenty of them don't. Plenty of them would prefer a multimedia element or a podcast, or they want to read about it. They want text. And I, in an online course, I can provide all of those things. I'm not limited by time, so I can offer all of these options and let them choose what works best for them in getting the content that they need. The other side of that, then, is offering options for assessment pieces to them. Because I'm not locked in by time, I'm allowed to say, if you can meet the objectives this way, this is an option. If you have other choices, other ways that you can show me what you know, I'm open to those. And so offering choice is one of my biggest elements in course design.
Can I ask questions?
Please.
Lisa, you mentioned, I think you said you were in teaching adults, correct?
Right.
So do you find a particular demographic of adult that is driven more towards online versus classroom? I mean, a lot of students that I teach in the adult arena like the interaction, like the one-on-one. Do you find people who have job requirements or family requirements, or they just prefer the time? Is that what drives them more towards online?
I've found so many different reasons that they're drawn to online. Some of them, they know it's not their best mode. They would prefer a face-to-face, but like you said, they don't have the time, or we don't have that option. So it can be all kinds of different reasons that students come to online. And I really don't see a standard type, not for the education classes that I'm teaching. Others, do you see a standard type?
For those of you that are teaching maybe in undergrad for traditional age college students, do you find it's more what they're used to, more the multimedia, like you said, podcasts, the YouTube, things like that? Is that kind of what spurs them towards online?
I have found at first what seems to spur them is they think it's going to be easier or save them time, and they don't have to go to class. In all honesty, when we started offering our Principles of Management class for several years in a row, 4 years in a row, we surveyed the students. Why are you taking this class? What do you expect to get out of it? And the majority of them said this is going to be easier. And then we continued to survey them and found out, this is not easier. Okay. Actually, some said this is not my style of learning. For some undergraduates, it's their first experience with online learning, and so they were surprised that it didn't really meet their needs. They just thought I didn't have to go to class. So I think from the undergraduate perspective, there's a learning curve just for them to understand what online learning is all about.
I think the other key component is a lot of like the flexibility of the scheduling. So a lot of our, especially our science majors and others, have very, very tight schedules, so they can fit it in. Of course, again, they don't realize it's going to take a lot of after-hours work.
Lisa, if you give students choices, especially about something like an assessment, how do you ensure that they're all fairly treated, or that they're being evaluated in an equivalent way?
Right. I'm a believer in rubrics and being very clear about what my learning targets are. Those two things help me a great deal. So oftentimes I'll have the rubric ready to go and show students this is what I'm looking for, and keep my elements in my rubric as broad as possible. Try not to limit it to certain activities, but to limit it to certain outcomes. What are the learning pieces that I want? what's the product itself. And so if I can open it up enough, they see what I'm looking for, then I think everyone is giving me what I need, for the guaranteed element of my course, but also they're getting what they need because they're approaching it in their best light.
If somebody's interested, will this be okay? If somebody's interested, Lisa teaches a class, it's in the program I direct, in differentiation. So if you'd like to get into her course, is it okay to put them in as a guest? You can look at really how she sets it up, how she differentiates the assignments and also the assessments. And it's students, I read all the reviews of the courses, and they absolutely love the course. They love that choice component, and it just works really well. I was going to follow up with a question with you, Lisa, too. I know community building is a really important thing to you, and I know you're a master face-to-face of it. If you could talk a little bit about what you see as maybe some best practices in terms of trying to do it, in an online environment.
Sure. It was the thing about switching to online or moving towards online that frustrated me the most, is that I had this skill set that I knew worked in face-to-face, and I felt like that skill set was really useless in some ways, or my arms were tied when it came to this screen now that was separating me from my students. The thing that I tried very intentionally is to make sure that I'm sharing little pieces of who I am outside of the content. So in my weekly announcements or in forum discussions or something, I'm allowing for these little tidbits about what I did over the weekend or what's happening with me personally or my family. Again, not because I want to over-reveal, but because I want them to see that I'm more than a voice, more than a set of PowerPoint slides, that there are other things I offer than just this course. The other part that I do when I narrate in a lecture, if the phone rings or the dog barks or my kid comes in and asks for a snack, I leave it in. And I apologize and I say, gosh, sorry that the phone rang, but I keep going. And I've found students react to that really positively. They say, that was great when your dog barked or whatever. My first thought is that's so unprofessional. But what it gives is validity to who I am, that I'm a real person out here trying my best to offer you content. You're trying your best to learn it. There's that intimacy about it. The other thing, sorry, can I keep going on now?
Go on, please.
The other thing is, just as I would in a face-to-face course, I would talk to students before and after class or in the hallway or wherever. I make sure that I'm doing that as best I can in an online course. So emails outside of the course specifically, to say, gosh, your assignment really had me going. Can I use it as an example? Or, you mentioned that in the water cooler forum that, you were looking for prayer about this issue. Can you update me what's going on? Anything like that where I'm talking to students as I normally would as a normal person, alongside the course, I think is really helpful, and it's not something that comes natural in an online setting. You have to really look for that.
I guess I can echo both of those. I'd say first, the main failing of the way we did CWC in the summer is we didn't build community at all. We were, we produced, I don't know how many hours worth of media at virtual museums, and so we just decided we couldn't do the community pieces. We didn't do discussion, whether by a board or something. And that'd be something for the future to build. In terms of building relationships with students, I'd echo both of the things you did. First of all, I think one thing that Sam and I were very nervous about is we were really teaching the course, and we were, Sam was narrating movies we were doing. I was editing. I was the docent in museums. But the best piece of teaching advice I got in my first year was from Stacy Hepton, political science, to say that your teaching persona is an amplification of your own personality. You need to let that come across, whether you're lecturing or leading discussion or facilitating a senior seminar. So the best thing we did by accident at the very last minute was to do weekly, essentially, webisodes that were intentionally silly. And I think it would be a little bit more like a small group discussion would normally be, but let us be ourselves a little bit more. I think we did that partly in the hope that it would lead to the second thing you talked about, which is students would actually want to continue conversations over email. And we made a point of writing a lot of feedback on the different daily writing assignments. Something I was disappointed by is how few students actually wanted to do that. And getting back to what Joyce, it makes me wonder about the motivations of why people do online, especially in the summer. We did address right off the bat, this was not going to be easier, it would be different. in my sense, one thing we have to do better is to communicate to students that you'll do better in this course if you're self-directed, self-motivated, if you can manage time well. Because otherwise, I had a student who simply dropped off the face of the earth for a week. I didn't hear anything. I mean, she finished the course and she managed to get a passing grade, but I'm just really worried about attrition because I think it was just this course that all of a sudden showed up, and most of our students have either failed or withdrawn before, and they thought, well, I'll get it done this way instead. And I think we'd rather have it be people who would self-select into a different way of doing the same kind of outcomes.
And I was thinking about that when you originally asked your question about motivations for taking classes. They're oftentimes different. The motivation is oftentimes different from the factors that will cause a student to be successful. Students that have done it a while, those things tend to match up a bit more because they know what they're good at, they know why they're doing it. But certainly a lot of first-time students, oftentimes there's a big divide between this is why I'm doing it and, oh, and these two characteristics that might actually help me succeed.
Matt, you sound pretty intelligent, so let's go to you next here with share some other thoughts, and again, just kind of jump in here.
Before Matt jumps in, can you say again the course that Lisa teaches in the program?
She's teaching a lot of.
The one that you said the average.
It's a MA in education. It's a grad level class for practicing K-12 teachers, and then EDUC 730 differentiation in.
Introduction to differentiation and responsive instruction.
Yep.
Sorry.
Your email is just L-Silzer,
Yes.
SILMSER at Bethel.edu. Okay, Matt?
As well, Jay, I would have worn a nicer t-shirt if I would have known you were recording this. I wrote down a few things because I can't remember anything. The first thing I wrote down was that all the normal instructional design rules apply, right? So I don't think there's anything anybody's going to say today or at the next round table that you can hold, Jay, that wouldn't apply equally well to your face-to-face courses. They just tend to be more, they stand out more starkly when you're in an online context. So properly written outcomes, then you design your assessments, then you design your content, your scaffolding activities, backward design. Also, I think it's really important to design for distant learners. If you're designing anything that's going to be distant at all in your course, even if you're going to have some face-to-face sessions. So if you're teaching a hybrid course, think in terms of how would I design this course if I were to never see these people physically, and then I view those face-to-face meetings as a kind of bonus. Like, okay, what can I do now face-to-face that maybe would have been a little more challenging in an online environment? And that kind of practice tends to create a little bit more of a rigorous course design, and you tend to think of a lot more potholes in advance and get things taken care of. So I found that to be important advice for myself when I'm designing my courses.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Please. I have found that students who are taking a hybrid course get really irritated when they come to a face-to-face session that could have been delivered online.
Yep.
And so making sure that we're using that face-to-face time to do something that is best done face-to-face, I think is really important. Because they see the alternative. I could stay home. I don't have to be here. What are you offering me that's better by driving here?
And typically that means the interactive part that can be done off the cuff, which is not all the interaction, but that part is best done face-to-face if you have that option. But content delivery, students show up to a hybrid course and someone's going to lecture to them for 30 minutes.
Or 4 hours.
Whatever. I appreciate it. I agree with that. Designed to reduce structural stress. That's a term our team uses to describe any kind of stress that a student experiences that doesn't have anything to do with learning objectives. And don't fool yourself into thinking that there's anything good about stress that the students experience that doesn't have anything to do with learning objectives. They're not paying for that, and that's not why they're here. Give them all the stress in the world regarding the learning objectives, right? But stay on target. And so if the student can't find anything from there's bad signage in the building to the syllabus doesn't make any sense to this website doesn't work, that is all distracting the students with their limited amount of cognitive space from what they're really there to be learning. So if it's something that ought to be one of the learning objectives, just write it in. I want students to be generally confused for the first 4 weeks of my class, and then we'll see if they can accomplish that. But typically we don't want that, obviously. And some ways to accomplish that reduction in structural stress. Simple is always better than complex. Sometimes, especially if we've taught a course a lot of different times, it can be tempting to want to get cute, or we get bored with the course a little bit and we don't realize it's the first time they've experienced it. And so elegant is always going to be better than overly complex. The design needs to speak for itself. So if I'm teaching at a distance, or if I'm designing my course for distance, and I realize as I'm designing this, I think I'm going to have to explain this one to the students. That's an indication I haven't designed it well enough yet. Now, no one's taught the perfect course yet. There's always going to be stuff that we don't think about or we don't get right. But if I'm always thinking in terms of, I want to do this in such a way that I have to explain as little as possible about the course to the students so they can focus as much on what the course process itself. That's a really good thing. I think the course site and syllabus should be identical. Syllabus should be identical to each other. Otherwise, a student has two separate documents that they're looking at. They're looking at one thing in Moodle, they're looking at another thing in their syllabus. There's also a lot of opportunities for me to get one way and one the other way. And so when I produce a syllabus, I write the syllabus before I even touch the course site. I don't put anything in Moodle until the syllabus is exactly the way I want it, and then I just cut and paste everything in. And if I can't cut and paste everything in, there's something wrong with my syllabus, not with my course site, at least for all the general structural elements. And that also means a real linear design. So in the courses that I teach, everything is put in the order in which the students are going to need it as much as possible, because that's how students approach all of our courses. It's a checklist to them, and that's okay. You know, my course isn't some kind of a research compendium or a dictionary I'm writing. It's a process that the students go through, and that doesn't mean it can't be inductive for them. The learning can be very inductive, but the process itself needs to be very obvious, so students can walk through it and not be confused about the process. And even I got to look at Lisa's courses. Even when she's got differentiation in her courses, it's very obvious to the students what their choices are and how they make those choices and when those choices are due and those kinds of things. Just a couple other things and I'll be done with my list here. As much as possible, if it's possible to develop cross-departmental, cross-program syllabi and course site designs, that's helpful for students because then they don't have to relearn how to navigate through your syllabus, through your course site, every time they get to another course in your department. That involves a lot of cooperation. Faculty are not always famous for doing things the same way on purpose, but it can be a really, really good thing. Some kind of weekly rhythm. This is an important thing that's really more true for online courses than for face-to-face courses. When you teach face-to-face, there's already a natural weekly or bi-weekly or twice-a-week rhythm because students are physically going somewhere for their course, for their classes. When you're online, that's not happening. So try to mimic that as much as possible with things like due dates and whatnot. Students seem to respond really well to that. And then finally, the simplest and most accessible form of media that you can find that's going to properly convey your content, that's what you want to use. So if you don't need to make a high-quality video to be able to put something across, and you can just do a little audio recording or something off of your webcam, that might be just fine. You don't get as attached to it as an instructor, which means you'll be more willing to change it when you need to and not try to just cope with it for the next 5 years. And students will appreciate it too because they'll feel like your course is more approachable, like Lisa was saying.
Yeah, Jane, I just want to say, I'm a fan of Jane.
Can you talk, Matt, a little bit about community of inquiry, kind of that model? I know you believe in it, and we've kind of brought it into the program I work with, and I'm a believer in it as well. But just talk a little bit about it, because it does have design implications.
Mm-hmm. Community of inquiry is a theory base that's been around for a while in distance ed circles, but it's really just as useful for face-to-face ed circles and hybrid ed circles. It's developed by a number of Canadian researchers back in the late 90s, and it's still the community that's researching it is still very, very active. And theory of community of inquiry says that there are 3 different kinds of presence that can be mediated through a course, and when they're all mediated together, in the middle of that you get a learning experience. One is social presence, which is the capacity that the participants in the course have to portray themselves as real, fully dimensioned persons. And that's not just the students, it's also the instructors. So to what degree can we be real in this environment? There's cognitive presence, which is the degree to which students are able to make meaning of what they're learning. So if you have a background in developmental psychology, or if you're a constructivist in your educational philosophy, you understand what that means. But just the idea that people don't really learn something until they take whatever fact is sitting out there and actually do something with it and contextualize it to their own mind and their own way of making meaning about the world. So to what degree are students able to do that? And then the final kind of presence is teaching presence, which is the ability that all the participants have to, or the degree to which they can all productively organize the learning environment for themselves. And obviously the teacher does a lot of that, because the teacher is the kind of the prime mover in creating the environment that everyone's living in. But the students are doing it too, because they're deciding when they're going to do their homework. They're deciding how they're going to interact with peers. They're deciding how much work they're going to put into something, which journals are going to look at for the research paper, all that stuff. So to what degree are people able to do that? When all three of those are working well together, these researchers have found that you end up with higher levels of learning in courses. And you can see why that wouldn't just be true in a face-to-face course. You could have a distance, in a distance course, you can have a face-to-face course where someone's just standing behind a podium and speaking and not letting anyone else speak to each other, where there's very little social presence in that classroom, even though everyone's physically present. And on the other hand, you have a distance course where people are very, very, very involved in knowing what's going on in the room and knowing each other, even though they're physically present. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Okay. Joyce, we'll hear from you.
Okay, great. I agree with everything that's been said, so I'll try to pick a few others that can go along with that. But one thing that I started doing was basically taking any of the courses I was going to put online or do hybrid and start over. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is saying, I'm just going to take my course and put it online. It's such a great time to just start over, start from scratch. So I go back to the basics, relook at, if it's already an existing class, go back to what are the objectives. So start from square one, I think, is real important. And then take the macro view of what are those objectives. And try not to worry about how we're going to assess yet. Just start with that macro view. Then you can get into the assessment part of it as well. The other thing that I do, and this isn't something that everybody has to do, but it really works well for me, is I plan out the entire semester then, once the syllabus is done. Because it seems like with online learning, you need to be ready to have all that interaction that Matt and Lisa were just talking about. In order to do that, you can't be worried about, oh, wait a minute, I've got to figure out what medium I'm going to use to get my lecture done, that type of thing. So there's a lot more prep work ahead of time when you're in that design phase. But to figure out all of those lectures and get that done, for me, works really well so that we can have that time, because it is obviously very labor-intensive to interact with the students while you're teaching the class. So that's a huge design thing for me as well. And then that's when, once again, I go into, what are the assignments? What do I think is going to work best? And to offer a variety. I don't quite do it the way Lisa does, so I want to get into your class and view that, so we all learn from each other, which is great. I think that's really intriguing. But what I try to do throughout the semester is offer different assessment methods, so that they're not just continually doing the same thing. It doesn't get boring to them. The routine is important. Matt was talking about setting that up is really important, but one week they might do a quiz online, the next week they might do a chapter assignment, then we might have a discussion. Change things up a little bit as long as they understand the process.
Yeah, that's one thing I thought was important. Is you can make every module the same, and the students start reacting to that as much as if every module is totally different. So there's some fine balance in there that you have to mix it up,
right.
But you don't want to mix it up too much.
Exactly. It's so frustrating.
Or you can keep the underlying parts of your process the same while making the activities that students are doing within them very, very different. The students are still getting unique experience their way without wondering if they're going to have one at all.
And that's where you can use the technological tool to organize it so it's clear that this is the same type of unit, or same type of function.
Jump in, comments, questions. It doesn't have to just be questions, too. You can throw your experiences in. Many people in Europe had experiences teaching online as well, too. So consider yourself panelists, too, if you want to make a point. It doesn't have to be just a question. Yeah.
Well, the emphasis on design to achieve, best way to put this, the emphasis on design to achieve predictable results makes me wonder about to what degree this seems to you to be either different from or similar to face-to-face teaching in that respect. And that those of us who have taught for a number of years often feel that if only we could teach last year's students again, we would actually, because we're always designing. So I'm curious about, as we're talking about kind of these rules for design, and I'm curious about whether you feel that teaching at a distance or teaching online or even the hybrid, that you in a sense feel that you have more control or more consistency, more predictability of outcome, or do students continue to behave like students? And sometimes it goes really well, and sometimes it doesn't go so well, and it doesn't really have anything to do with what you've done.
It's a good question. I have found that with my face-to-face classes, online or hybrid, it's the same for me. I don't know what panelists feel as well, but I mean, I could design this online. It could go fabulous. I could, say, oh, this is great. It worked. I'm going to do it again, and all of a sudden, it doesn't work as great the next semester because of, once again, the mix of students, what the expectations are. So I try to do as much as possible with all classes, whether they're face-to-face or online, and say what worked, what didn't, why did it work, why didn't it work, that type of thing. So I don't think you're never done with your online design, just like we're never done with our face-to-face design.
My opinion is that my online or hybrid courses go better than my face-to-face courses because I'm required to be intentional. My laziness kicks in face-to-face, where I go, oh, you know what? I'll be able to wing that, or I'll be able to handle that next week, and then life happens. And whereas online, you don't have that option. There is no winging online. And so, I've learned a little bit about that intentionality, and it's transferred to my face-to-face courses to, trying to have as much designed ahead of time at the beginning of a whole series of sessions. But I think online and hybrid requires me to be more intentional, and I think the outcome is better.
I think there also are those independent variables you're alluding to, Barrett. I know you can get somebody in the course who's very vocal, who will set a tone in the course that makes it very difficult oftentimes to, both at face-to-face and online, to kind of deal with that. And of course that can either make positive or negative the entire experience of the rest of the students.
There's a website that you can go to called nosignificantdifference.org. If you want to run some research on it, some of you are familiar with that. And it's a compendium of research that's been done on the media study topic. So essentially, do people learn better from this or that? I mean, the classic media study is, or the stereotypical one is, do people learn better reading books or watching TV? That kind of thing. But in this case, it would be, do people learn better online? They learn better face-to-face. And the research is fairly clear that actually there's no significant difference in a statistical sense, as long as the designs are equivalent. And that's a sticky wicket. But as long as the design's equivalent, people learn equally well.
Okay, Chris, if we can hear from you. Sure. Again, I feel like I have relatively little talk here. Because one thing we need to do is review how last year went. And so I guess the first principle I would have is it's easier to do this with someone else. I don't know how you do it alone, actually. Assuming you don't do it alone, you probably talk to other people. I actually took Jay's question and tried to step back more into the principles we had as we were approached with the idea of taking CWC online. And I guess what makes teaching online attractive or hybrid attractive to me, given that I have a pretty strong preference for doing face-to-face. And I'm not convinced that for the kind of things I actually think education is supposed to do, online can do it as well. But that might come back next month. And there were three things that made it attractive to me. One is accessibility. I know it's a conversation we have to have at a bigger institutional level, but it removes some obvious barriers that otherwise people can't be here to take. Certainly it applies to adult and graduate programs, but maybe it can apply in undergraduate. Maybe there are ways people can take adult education, otherwise they couldn't do it because it was too costly, because they don't want to be in Minnesota, whatever it is. Where I'm more interested with that are the ways in which we can reach other constituents. And so we've had a lot of conversations about how we
can take what we're doing for 18 to 22 or 18 to 24-year-olds, can we make this available to churches? So we're already piloting something with a church that Sam has a connection to see if we could develop something like an adult Sunday school curriculum out of the Western Civ thing we did for college students. I think Joyce already hinted at is to seize it as a moment to start from scratch. Sam said this really well a couple weeks ago when we did a library presentation, so I'll just give a short version of it. But it's an almost 30-year-old course that hasn't changed a lot in 30 years. And so it was a good moment to think, can we do something that's recognizably CWC that doesn't look anything like CWC, that doesn't have lectures or an online version of lectures, that doesn't have a small group discussion or an online version of it. And so I like the idea of online being creatively disruptive in that sense. And of course, as you think, if we're not going to do that, how would you do this with movies? I mean, that led us to virtual museums, to websites. And so I appreciate that it forces you to start over again. At the same time, what I'm most interested about with online is that it can enrich face-to-face instruction, because that's really where I want to keep doing my job. I'm happy to try online, but that's not where I'm going to make today. That's not where I feel most fulfilled. It's not where I'm convinced I teach well to students. And so I'd rather do it as a way to experiment and try out some things that will feed back into the face-to-face instruction that I do. And so I'm necessarily putting up some limits on how far I want to go with online, but we said a lot about this 2 weeks ago, but we've already started to use some of the things we developed for the online course in the face-to-face course. And I think we probably would develop a hybrid course at some point that fuses some of the best of online with some of the things that we really felt like we couldn't do online, like some of the personal interaction that you alluded to earlier. So, I think those had implications for course design, but I'm not really sure they're as practical principles as what you all are talking about.
Thoughts at all? Chris or Sam, too. Sam was heavily involved.
Sam should really be up here, but
I dressed like you today. So.
kind of eerie.
Okay, Bob, if you want to share some of your thoughts.
Sure. Well, I guess it's good I'm last because I think I mainly put together some lists of things that I was thinking about as Jay asked the questions of, well, how do you design for online? What is there? What were my experiences that I went through as a faculty member teaching face-to-face, learning to design online, and then to teach others to teach online. From a really, some would say, I would say before a lot of the theory was there, as people were developing the theory, although Matt would claim it goes back to archaic or at least medieval times. But
since it's a pretty old
yeah,
field.
he keeps saying that. But for us real faculty, it really wasn't. So I really divided up into three kind of groups. High-level design principles. What do I really look at when I'm starting design? And then theoretical principles, which is what we talked quite a bit about here. And then what I would call functional design principles. And I had four high-level design principles that I thought fit kind of course, but they're not entirely separate, so they're overlapping a little bit. And then I thought as I was writing them down, oh, wait a minute, the initials are DF. That's starting pretty low. Where's the A's and B's and C's? But they weren't there. Of course, the first one was design. You can kind of guess that. And one of the first things I ask my students to do is design a model for your course. I mean, just don't think of a model from the syllabus, but you want to design, okay, think about the technology, think about the layout, think about the way students are going to come into the classroom and sit down and learn and then talk to each other. So kind of the learning space design online as opposed to the learning space, which we do a poor job of that as well, in the physical classroom. So we need to really think about learning space design in the online classroom. The second was the next F, the function. We really need design for functionality, and that, again, relates to design as well, and that includes your outcomes, how they achieve those outcomes, how the students actually interact with each other, so the physical functionality of the learning process. And then the fourth high level was detail. And again, everybody's alluded to that, how much detail you have to put in there that you can wing it or say in class. If it's in the syllabus, but you didn't put it in the assignment, the student has to go look in the syllabus to find out what they're supposed to do in Moodle. that's not an appropriate building of detail. Put the syllabus component, like Mike said, and Matt said, in the Moodle spot. So it's right there in the functional place where they're needed to do it. And then finally, everybody's alluded to this as well, flexibility. That's important in designing physical spaces in classrooms. It's important in the online classroom as well. Build in options for diverse learners, diverse technology, along with keeping that consistency and scaffolding and things like that. So that's at kind of a high level. The theoretical design principles I didn't create at all, because the ones I really like are Chickering and Yameson's 7 Principles of Best Practice, which essentially are encourage contact between faculty and students, communication, develop reciprocity and cooperation among students, collaboration, give prompt feedback. I hear that quite a bit from Joel and Barrett and everybody else. It's there, and it's really critical online more so than anything else. The student feels alone out there. If you communicate to them and others communicate to them, they're more there. Emphasize time on task. If you waste all your time fiddling with the technology, you're not learning. So how you design that in functionality and design come into play in the detail. Communicate high expectations. So make your students aware it's not easier, but here's how they can do it and do it well. And then, not finally, this is the last of the 7, is respect diversity and ways of learning. So much of the same kind in terms of that flexibility of design. But I had an 8th one when I teach my students, and that is building learning community. Because really, in the online, building a community of learners has to be more focused than it does even in a face-to-face class. It kind of happens in a face-to-face classroom pretty well most of the time. It doesn't happen unless you're doing it on purpose and encouraging that building in community, that cooperation and collaboration from the class. Finally, there's some functional design principles that I use. One might give me some flack. Know thy technology. If you don't know the technology, how do you use it or expect your students to use it? And we see that over and over and over in TLT. Or a faculty member says, I'm going to have my students do a narrated PowerPoint. They've never done a narrated PowerPoint or uploaded it into Moodle. And they don't realize how much of a daunting task that can be. So if you know your technology, you can explain it to the students so it really functions. They don't waste their time. Communicate, communicate, communicate. It's really critical. And that's not just between you and the students, between the students and the students to build that learning community. Build in learner options and flexibility. Back to what Lisa does very, very well. Minimize transactional distance, kind of what Matt was talking about, so that people, again, see you there in all those different types of theoretical, social, teaching, and what was the other one? Cognitive. So all that's there. So it's kind of all blending together and all brings them closer together in what could be a distant environment but doesn't need to be. And then design each component. And I like to think of 4 simple parameters when I'm designing every component of the course. Why am I asking the students to do it, or why am I doing it? What am I asking the students to do, and how do they do it? Where are they supposed to do it, and when are they supposed to do it? If those components are always clear, the students aren't going to come to you for questions, and they're going to be able to do it effectively. Those are kind of the key components I look at in terms of a functional perspective.
So you're all experienced teachers, and Chris, I think you've made your opinion known on face-to-face. So in what situations do you think face-to-face is a better option?
Face-to-face is always a better option if you're, I think I said this before, not just in my view, the research bears this out too, when we're expecting people to have fairly spontaneous kinds of conversations, or where we're doing the sorts of things that they would normally do when they're face-to-face, so we don't have to try to have some kind of accommodation for students that's not natural to them. So that's typically when it's better. That hybrid courses really are the most effective environments for students to learn, if it's at all possible, to have a combination of distance tools and face-to-face tools to use.
Okay. I guess since Bob did a lab online, it just proves that anything can be done in an online.
Yeah, my motto is anything you can do face-to-face, you can do online. You just have to think very carefully about how to do it. So I think I would say you could even do some highly interactive stuff online, but you may want to use a synchronous tool.
Right. Yeah,
So-
you can do anything online if you have enough. It's like that despair.com poster with the pyramids that says achievement, and the last thing you need is an inexhaustible supply of manual labor. As long as you have
The right
as long as you
technology.
have unlimited resources, you can do it online. It's just that it can get very expensive in some way.
So Chris and Sam could teach the entire multi-section course of CWC online. But it would take a lot of staffing, a lot of work to do that, because you guys couldn't do it. Essentially, it would be like a MOOC,
Yeah.
but a lot more, especially the way you do it.
Just make an observation here. I think when it comes to online or hybrid instruction, pretty much like any instructional strategy, you've got people that are what I call kind of walkers, kind of starting off, and then you've got joggers, and then you've got runners. And I think in here we've probably got all three of those, and I think on the panel we've got primarily runners here, I think, but maybe some joggers, and I don't know. I don't think you're a walker anymore. I saw what you're doing with your course, but I think it's real interesting what happens when someone has taught online for maybe a little more than once or twice, once they've moved into it, third time, fourth time, fifth time. If you as panelists could talk a little bit about kind of maybe your understanding, how you feel about what you do, what you've seen with your learning, how you think about what you're doing, what your role is as an instructor. Maybe talk about that evolution a little bit that happens from being more of the walker to being a little more of a runner with it. There's a lot to be learned about this enterprise.
Well, and I would say sometimes I feel like a jogger, even though I've been doing this for quite a long time. And part of it is the technology just continues to change. So there is something about if you choose to teach in this environment, you do need to keep up with it best we can, and that's why we have an incredible TLT team to help us with that. I mean, utilize them quite often, and I think that's important to know that we have a great resource for that. I think the other thing that's really encouraged me to continue to do some hybrid courses in particular, which happens to be my favorite as well, I think it's the best of both worlds, is that it really impacts the different students and how they learn. I mean, to take somebody who typically would be an introvert that doesn't like to raise their hand in class, that really is quiet all the time, to see them just come alive in an online class is just so absolutely rewarding. It's just incredible. And to have them even say, wow, I just felt so great and to able to, be heard in class. And so those kinds of things come out that make me want to jog a little bit, or run a little bit more than jog as well, because it's so incredible to see students have that opportunity. The other thing that I have heard from students, and this is different if they're, a freshman, sophomore taking the class, maybe it's their first time online, which is getting to be more rare because they're having more opportunities in high school, obviously, to be exposed to this. But many times I find it interesting, they say, wow, this is a different online class than I've had from any other experiences. They've had one or two experiences. And I said, well, have you found that your face-to-face classes are different too? I do. And it's like, so I try to get that put together. That's right. So your online classes are going to be different as well. And that for some reason, I think that all online classes are going to be exactly the same. So I use that kind of as a teachable moment for them as well to say, you're going to be in all different environments. And, with my background being human resource management, we're trying to prepare in the business and economics department students to go out into that work world. Online learning is the fastest growing training and development concept out there. And so we want students to be able to go into the business world if that's where they're going, or into any kind of job, whatever the environment is, regardless of job. Companies now are saying your new employee orientation is online. You're going to have to do some continuing education online. And if they've never been exposed to that and think it's all the same or it's all passive, they're not as prepared. So that kind of keeps me energized to say, let's use some tools that we have and do a hybrid when we can, because we need that face-to-face, and I so value that. But I also just see the value of some of those online tools.
And the nice thing about those online tools is they're getting simpler and more effective.
Yeah.
Whereas when we had to build our own websites as faculty, and some of you remember that, hey, Moodle's a cinch to use. You build a website with just the tools in it. You can create multimedia that we couldn't do 10 years ago with no problem. Who heard of a narrated PowerPoint? You had to really force PowerPoint to do something like
I think I would say that one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that I shouldn't confuse my personal preferences with what works. And that seems simplistic, but when we get into rhetorical mode, when it comes to trying to figure out what we ought to do going forward, sometimes it's easy to confuse those two things. I don't actually prefer to teach online at all. So if I never taught another online class ever again, like a fully online class, distance class, I'd be perfectly happy. And that may sound kind of weird just in doing what I do here. I love all the systems and the building that goes into actually designing them. But I love the feeling I get when I'm done teaching it, and it works out, and I have students that learn. But I'm super verbal, and so I'm one of those people that actually does really well in that face-to-face class, and I can thrive in that environment, and I can teach well in that environment. And I love drawing other people out in the environment, so I totally get that. So I hope you'll take that as an encouragement especially for those of you that don't naturally prefer to be in that environment, that there are still some things that I know that my students get in that environment that I can't give them in a face-to-face environment, even though I don't prefer to give it to them at all. Right? Like in my natural state. And so it's a discipline then for me to say, I need to get better at this, I need to learn this. This is a way for me to expand my teaching ability. And then it also is nice to be able to sit next to instructors who are saying, I'm not sure, and say, yeah, I know exactly how you feel, and here's how I deal with that, and here's how I've grown in that area. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I've learned the last 10 years.
I know that online is good for me because it challenges me in ways that my face-to-face teaching hasn't. Not that I'm not working hard to be challenged there and expand, my repertoire, but online, I came kicking and screaming. It was not my first love, like, oh yay, I can teach through a computer. That sounded terrible.
Me too.
And so I really feel like I have this split personality thing going. I have face-to-face students who say, I can't believe that you can teach online because this is so, yeah, great. Or my online students will say, well, what do you even do face-to-face? Because this is clearly, and it's just odd to me. Because when you asked which is better or why would you do face-to-face then, they're completely parallel things. They do a lot of the same things, they get you to the same place, but the way you get there is so different. I don't know. It really feeds two sides of who I am as an instructor. And I love the challenge of it.
Walkers can speak here if you're... No. Well, I think, I really can't answer your question because I don't understand. The main thing that I think about is that in both of the two courses I've done hybrid or online, the initial investment of time was enormous because it was recording in the first place 12 hours worth of podcasts that were not simply one shot. It was editing all sorts of things together. And then, amplify that by 10, and that was with 2 people for this past summer. So what I'm worried about is the second iteration will be, well, that's done, now we'll just kind of offer that again. And so we have to fight against that impulse. We already did the work, now we can just kind of re-offer this. And I think there's some pride in what we're doing and awareness that we didn't do it perfectly the first time. So I'm sure we'll find ways to change. But again, I think it's a reason I'm glad that I'm doing it with someone else too, because we'll constantly be checking each other and pushing each other. And hopefully maybe bringing a third person to teach it too. Have a fresh set of eyes.
If I could just say too, this is a great example of what I said earlier, where the more complex your process is, and your process is complex, and the product's amazing, but the more complex it is, the more in concrete it tends to stay, because it's really hard to repeat, and it's draining to repeat. And so that's always a balancing act.
That's how we're going to do ours too, though. Ours is a lot more flexible than it appears.
Right. Yeah, maybe it's just a natural inclination that people have when they work really hard on something to not want to change it.
And we intentionally built in, of the 3 parts of the course, 2 of them we made evergreen, 1 we made so we could never use it again. The webisodes are made to be disposable, but we couldn't reuse those. So we forced ourselves to build one component that we would have to rebuild.
One of the things you mentioned last week is you took some takeaways from your online teaching that will help your face-to-face teaching. I think it's a very typical experience. It's like I remember learning Spanish helped me understand English better, more than any English course I ever took. Teaching online helped you understand really the process you use in a face-to-face class of teaching.
I think we're going to wrap up here. We're right about at 5. I want to mention what the next session really will be about. We're going to have the same folks back here, assuming you would like them back. Which I think let's give them a round of applause. What we're going to focus on it's October 28th. What we're going to focus on now is really facilitation of online learning, and a big part of this whole deal is building an online course, and it is a big undertaking. But I'm personally really convinced that a lot of the gains that can really come from online learning actually come from this whole second part of the equation. What is it that you're doing or not doing once your course is actually underway? And that's where I want us to get into talking a little bit about discussion forums, talking a little bit about feedback, about building community a little bit more. And I honestly think that's the real power that can be in online, because if you design well up front, I think you can put 90-95% of your energies into really working with your students and really providing that kind of formative assessment that can really move them forward. So that's what we'll talk about next time. So come again, and come with some questions as well. This was helpful. Let some of your colleagues know that we're working on the same theme again as well. But thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.